Irene, I'll turn to you. And I know that Nell put out a report recently. I think there was a statistic that about two-thirds of US workers report being digitally surveilled at work. But the report also highlights that there's been a lot of progress over the years in laws protecting people at the intersection of labor and technology. So we've made some progress, but there's still a long way to go. So I'd love to hear from you, Irene. What do you see as what's needed in this next generation of bossware and surveillance work policies? Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. So one of the biggest issues we've seen is how companies are now using bossware to discipline workers. People are describing being surveilled by AI-enabled cameras and trackers when they don't know what's being tracked or what kinds of violations will lead to penalties. And given that in this country, most of us can be legally fired anytime without warning and without even any information about the reason, adding digital surveillance and AI to that mix is basically like putting at-will employment on steroids. And as we've now seen, the increasing precarity for workers and the impact on people's health and safety and their livelihoods has been enormous. So what is required then is to actually strengthen the underlying basic worker protections that were missing or too weak to begin with and are now needed more urgently than ever. Sometimes the instinct for policy is to go after the tech itself, limit its use, stipulate how it can be used, and we do need to regulate the use of the tech, absolutely. But just as importantly, we need to update protections related to everything that the tech touches. So one of the best examples of a new policy that does this is the Warehouse Worker Protection Act that Shahryar and others at the WWRC developed. It responds to Amazon's abusive surveillance regime by tackling the underlying lack of standards for disciplinary transparency and by giving workers strong firing protections, among other things. So in terms of what is needed in the next generation of policies, there are really three key principles. First, we hear a lot about human oversight. And yes, human oversight of these systems is important, but by itself, it's inadequate. For example, we've seen that a software system that rapidly produces disciplinary recommendations for human managers to rubber stamp can be just as harmful as a fully automated system. With these new technologies being used for discipline, we need basic standards, due process, fair warnings, a chance to improve, and employer liability for bad data and mistakes. With these new technologies being used to determine wages, we need things like detailed wage statements, guaranteed minimum wages, stronger wage theft protections, and so on. The second key principle is that true transparency has to be comprehensive. That means disclosure not only of the tech that's being used, but of all of the operations the tech touches. For example, on discipline, we need every piece of information related to the potential for discipline. What are the performance standards, the metrics, the rationale for any action taken, the data, the outputs, everything. And the third principle is that any policies aimed at regulating tech have to include provisions that give people more power, both individual and collective, such as robust anti-retaliation and firing protections, private rights of action, and the right to have designated worker representatives receive mandated disclosures. Beyond that, we also need guaranteed severance and better access to unemployment insurance so that workers have the power to walk away. And we need to articulate a positive right to autonomy on the job, not just a right to privacy. And most importantly, of course, workers need unions.
Well said. And then anything else in terms of what this next generation of policies that you've outlined, how it relates to the broader AI surveillance pipeline, not just in our workplaces, but in our communities as well?
Right. So the three principles I just described extend beyond the workplace too. In addition, we have to convene more targeted policy conversations. I think there's a danger of overbroad policies with weakish provisions in the efforts to cover as much tech and as many kinds of issues as possible. So, for example, simply adding human oversight to AI in a very general way for all kinds of issues, immigration, healthcare, housing, is not a silver bullet. But if we are trying to regulate the tech used in immigration or healthcare or any other arena, the first question we have to ask is how are we giving the people who are most impacted more individual and collective power? And how are we strengthening those foundational and very specific rights? Otherwise, it's just a band-aid.